103 BCE. The Hellenistic world is coming to an end. Greece itself has been under Roman rule for over half a century. The Seleucid Empire, which once terrorized the Jews, is now barely larger than Judea itself. Now, the nations of West Asia will determine their own fate. A Jewish queen will rise higher than any king before her, and for a single generation, Judea will become an empire. When we last left off, Judea was in crisis. The tyrannical reign of Aristobulus, the first Jewish king since the Davidic period, had lasted just a year. His widow Alexandra had engineered a coup against his chosen successor. The rains of autumn had brought forth a new political order, led by a 24-year-old king, Alexander Yanai, and his 38-year-old queen. However, the constitutional crisis that had unfolded under Alexander's father and brother remained unresolved. The Pharisees continued to argue that no one man could serve as both king and high priest. Alexandra should have been in the perfect position to resolve the crisis. She had proven her political skills by engineering the palace coup, and her younger brother, Simon ben Shetach, was a rising star among the Pharisees and would soon be elected to the Great Sanhedrin. But then something quite unexpected happened. At 38 years old, Alexandra became pregnant. By 40, she had given birth to 2 sons, and raising them at this advanced age would largely remove her from politics for the time being. This left King Alexander to untangle the political deadlock between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and he might actually have done that if foreign affairs hadn't gotten in the way. Several years earlier, an Egyptian prince named Ptolemy Lathyrus had set up a breakaway kingdom in Cyprus after losing a civil war to his mother. In the ensuing years, he had successfully gained dominion over the former Phoenician city-states, including the Seleucid enclaves that still existed along Judea's coastline. Sensing an opportunity to secure an alliance with its most powerful neighbor, Judea declared war on Ptolemy. The first phase of the conflict was a complete disaster, with Ptolemy invading the Galilee and committing all manner of war crimes. But after securing assistance from the Egyptian army, Alexander managed to not only retake the Galilee, but conquer the Golan Heights. There he encountered the Etrurians, an Arab tribe renowned as mounted archers, and made them a deal. Not only would the Etrurians be allowed to live peacefully as Judean subjects, but they would be welcome to convert to Judaism in order that their unique fighting skills be put to use in the Judean army. With a newfound cavalry in tow, Alexander successfully conquered Dor, and by 96 BCE had conquered Gaza. But this latter move was a problem. Alexander wasn't supposed to take Gaza. That task had been given to another Egyptian ally, the Arab kingdom of Nabatea, but the Judean army had reached the city first with its fancy new horses. By taking Gaza, Judea now had a monopoly on trade between the Arabian Peninsula and the Mediterranean Sea, giving Alexander the power to utterly dominate Nabatea economically. And so, war. In 93 BCE, Alexander was pinned in the Yarmouk River Valley by, no joke, a camel cavalry, sued for peace, and limped back to Jerusalem with his tail between his legs. Judea managed to keep all of its new territories, including Gaza, but lost control over its own eastern border. At this point, Alexander had been in power for a decade, during which domestic policy was basically non-existent, and his dual role as king and high priest had been impossible to fulfill. That Sukkot, which coincidentally was the 10th anniversary of his coronation, Alexander entered the gates of Jerusalem only to be met with angry, jeering crowds in the tens of thousands. Sukkot is the Jewish harvest festival, and usually coincides with the first rainfall after the long, dry summer. Traditionally, worshippers must purchase this snarly-looking fruit called an etrog for the holiday, and when Alexander began the opening ceremony, the men in attendance used them to pelt him. Now, if you're Jewish, you're probably thinking 2 things. That's hilarious, and those are heavy. Now imagine getting whipped by hundreds of them. In retaliation, Alexander called on a personal force of mercenaries from Asia Minor to execute 6,000 of the worshippers, boarded up the temple complex, and declared war on the Pharisees, who again were the majority party, so he may as well have declared war on his own country. To that end, the bulk of the Great Sanhedrin relocated to the city of Sepphoris in the Galilee. From there, Simon ben Shetach, now deputy leader of the Pharisees, called for assistance from, of all people, the new Seleucid king, Demetrius III. In 89 BCE, a combined force of Seleucids and Pharisees dealt Alexander a devastating blow at Shechem. wiping out all of Alexander's foreign mercenaries just 50 kilometers from Jerusalem. The defeat was so overwhelming that Alexander went into hiding in the mountains, and it looked like the Pharisees would soon win the war. But then, as was the case more often than not at this point, the Seleucid Empire collapsed into a civil war of its own, forcing Demetrius to withdraw his forces and abandon the Pharisees to their fate. They basically had three choices. Almost the entire Pharisee army, the ordinary rank and file, defected back to Alexander and the Sadducees. The highest-ranking politicians, like Simon ben Shetach, used their connections and resources to flee the country, mostly for Egypt. This left 800 Pharisee lieutenants to a truly sadistic fate. First, they were rounded up in the plaza between the Temple Mount and the Hasmonean Palace. There, King Alexander brought out the Pharisees' wives and children to be cut down by the sword while they helplessly watched. Finally, the 800 men were crucified while Alexander watched over a celebratory feast. And it's here where we reach one of the great ironies of Jewish history. By winning the war so brutally, he had lost the peace. Most of the Jews living in diaspora were sympathetic to the Pharisees, and while nobody could defeat Alexander militarily, they could defeat him politically. And it just so happened that his two sons had recently reached adulthood, freeing up Queen Alexandra to do what she did best. Around 87 BCE, Alexander held a dinner for a visiting delegation from the Parthian Empire. The king and his guests drank and talked through the entire night. But at a lull in the conversation, one of the Parthians worked up the courage to note a conspicuous absence. "Where is Rabbi Simon?" he asked. "We have always enjoyed and profited by his wisdom in our previous visits." At this, Queen Alexandra spoke. "My brother is away in Egypt, but I'm sure he will return soon." She cast her eyes at her husband. After 16 years shut away in the nursery, she was once more the senior partner. 2 weeks later, Simon returned from exile in Egypt, regained his seat in the Great Sanhedrin. Then he arrived at dinner with the Parthians, taking a seat directly between the king and queen. Alexander was silent, until Simon turned and said, "The wisdom which I serve grants me equal rank with kings." With that, the last vestiges of absolute monarchy in Judea were swept away. While Alexander busied himself with ever more military conquests, Simon and Alexandra worked tirelessly to flip control of the Great Sanhedrin. Throughout the 80s BCE, Judea's cities began replacing their Sadducee representatives with Pharisees until they comprised almost half of the Sanhedrin. Pharisee leaders forced into exile were invited back, and the high priesthood was reformed from a hereditary position to an elected one. Alexander Yanai spent the rest of his life on campaign beyond the walls of Jerusalem, a prisoner in his own kingdom, which is why, on his deathbed in 76 BCE, he left the throne not to either of his adult sons, but to Alexandra. This was her empire. Alexander had been ill for some time, and had summoned the queen to his deathbed while leading a siege at Ragaba, a fortress on the Nabatean border. Alexandra kept her husband's death secret so as not to lower morale until the fortress had fallen. But when the Jews triumphed, Alexandra returned to Jerusalem as queen regnant. Within a year, the Pharisees had become the majority in the Sanhedrin, with Simon as Nasi. Alexandra's eldest son Hyrcanus was made high priest, finally separating the power of the temple and the state in accordance with Pharisee policy. The Pharisees also created a bunch of new laws, establishing a formal education system and criminalizing perjury and obstruction of justice without exception. Ultimately, under Simon ben Shetach, the Sanhedrin became so powerful that periods of Jewish history started being defined not by the reigns of the monarch, but by the terms of office of the Nasi and Av Bet Din, known collectively as the Zugot. Meanwhile, Sadducee ministers who had committed atrocities in the Civil War were increasingly found in bed with swords run through them. Desperate for protection, the Sadducees recruited Alexandra's younger son, Prince Aristobulus, to lobby his mother on their behalf. Alexandra agreed to let the Sadducees flee Jerusalem and defend the borders of the kingdom. But in reality, it was all for show, as Alexandra was already recruiting a huge army of foreign mercenaries to deter any neighboring powers that might want to take a piece of the empire. And lest you think she was going power mad like either of her husbands, Alexandra's proclivity towards nonpartisan foreign fighters was not only prudent, but absolutely necessary for the time. Over the previous decade, the entirety of West Asia had devolved into a chaotic free-for-all as the Seleucid Empire collapsed once and for all into a confusing network of city-states, leading its neighbors to the north, Pontus and Armenia, to make a play for the entire region in what became known as the Mithridatic Wars. As many of these city-states were Roman allies, one might expect a rapid response. But Rome at this time was undergoing multiple civil wars, from the slave uprising of Spartacus to the repeated clashes between Marius and Sulla. The Romans were able to keep it together just long enough to stop Pontus from conquering all of Greece and Anatolia, but Armenia had free reign. By the time of Alexandra's coronation, the Armenian king Tigranes the Great had stitched together an empire stretching from the Caspian to the Mediterranean. In 69 BCE, Alexandra sent emissaries to Tigranes, assuring him that unlike the nations he had already conquered, he would find no fault with the Jewish people or their queen. Tigranes was impressed with the ambassadors and assured them that he would keep Judea and the queen in his favor after his armies marched into Jerusalem. At long last, it appeared that these two unlikely empires would finally clash. But, just as had happened so many times to the Maccabees a century earlier, salvation came in the form of a letter. The slave revolt in Italy was over, and the Romans were on the march. Pontus had already fallen, and western Armenia was in flames. Tigranes rushed back to Armenia, his empire crumbling behind him, only to be defeated by the Romans at the Battle of Tigranocerta. But the Jewish empire would not last much longer. In 67 BCE, Alexandra died, and the power and prosperity of Judea would go with her. She had failed to heal the violent divisions between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who had each found a royal champion in her two sons. Because of this, the final battle of the Mithridatic Wars would be fought not in Pontus or Armenia, but in the streets of Jerusalem. Special thanks to my patrons, including Gaonete level patron Vicky Nelson. If you like this video, you can also donate via Patreon link below. You can also check out my book, An Armada of Cats Travels in Israel, along with links to my sources for this video. Otherwise, you can always like, share, and subscribe. I will see you next time.